This is the Project 941, named the Shark. It carries 160 crew members, 22 torpedoes, 20 enormous ballistic missiles packed full of 200 nuclear warheads with a destructive potential of more than 2,000 of the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's fast, slick, and complex, but it's also the largest submarine ever built. Nearly 575 feet, 175 meters long, far longer than an American football field. The 1950s and 60s were a fascinating age of immense technological development. It was imperative that the navies of the world's forces keep up because of new, terrifying existential threats. The submarine went very quickly from serving the same role as it had in the First and Second World War to providing a near undetectable platform to host the world's most destructive weapons. A world leader in development was, of course, the United States Navy, but two of the most radical and extreme designs came instead from the Soviet Union. The Lyre and the Shark, known to the Western world as Alfa and Typhoon. Alfa, capable of higher speed underwater than history's fastest ocean liner, and the Typhoon, a monster of a submarine, a launching platform of unimaginable destruction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the story of two of the Soviet Union's most unhinged submarine designs. The Soviet Union was a vast empire, remembered today by many for its strict authoritarian rule, censorship, and oppression that forced millions of its citizens into a very tough way of life. But it was also a force for innovation. In the air, Ukrainian-designed Antonov aircraft soared and supplied ground troops. Above the atmosphere, Soviet cosmonauts and satellites carried the hammer and sickle into space. In a fiercely competitive, tit-for-tat world, the USSR aggressively sought to challenge the United States on all fronts, on the ground, in the skies, and in outer space. But some of the fiercest technological competition was happening on and below the waves of the world's oceans. By the mid-1950s, with American nuclear-powered submarines prowling oceans across the globe, the Soviet Union's fleet of antiquated World War II-era subs was woefully inadequate to counter this new and existential threat from the West. The Soviets had tried to respond to these new American submarines with a nuclear boat of their own in the form of Project 627 Kit. With the NATO codename November, the Project 627 was never initially meant to be a nuclear-powered sub at all. But with the launch of the nuclear-powered American USS Nautilus in 1954, a response was sorely needed to maintain the Soviet Union's appearance as a dominant world power. And while the November class was indeed a fully nuclear-powered boat, it was plagued with reliability problems and issues stemming from its rushed design and construction. As the 1950s wore on and newer American subs were hitting the water, it was clear that the November class just wasn't going to cut it. But this time, instead of just improving an existing design, like what had always been done in the past, Soviet planners set out to produce an all-new boat, and they were pulling out all the stops. See, in the past, the primary goal of a conventional submarine had been to ambush enemy shipping, motoring on the surface into position, and then submerging to attack merchant vessels and convoys carrying important supplies, or the occasional warship. The German U-boat campaigns in the Atlantic during both the First and Second World War being prime examples of this. But by this point in the Cold War, that strategy was rapidly being flipped on its head. With nuclear-powered submarines able to stay submerged for months at a time, and with advancements in sonar and weapons technology, the submarine was fast becoming a lethal hunter-killer, capable of running down whole fleets of enemy warships while remaining underwater, and even hunting other submarines. The new boat would need to be unlike any other Soviet submarine ever before if the Communist Empire wished to stay in the mix of the rapidly evolving arms race with the West. Initial proposals for the new submarine were submitted by Russian naval architect R.M. Rusinov in 1957, with the actual design of the sub itself assigned to the Malakit Design Bureau, then known as SKB 143, in 1960. Engineers at Malakit must have let out an exasperated sigh when they first learned of the job ahead of them. The requirements for the new boat were daunting, to say the least, with a need for a top speed high enough to outrun any NATO surface ship or submarine, while also being maneuverable enough to dodge enemy torpedoes and have a minimal crew complement with high levels of automation. Easy. Well, not really. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before. This new submarine, dubbed Project 705 or Lyra, was by far the most ambitious and advanced submarine project the Soviet Union, or anyone else for that matter, had ever undertaken. To complete this and deliver a boat that met the lofty requirements, designers and engineers had no choice but to get creative and take some risks. First, there was the problem of the speed. Project 705 wasn't only going to need a lot of power, but would also have to be small and lightweight. In terms of shipbuilding, these two things are often in stark contrast with one another, because more power typically meant installing a larger, heavier power plant. But to outrun NATO ships and submarines, a large, heavy boat simply wouldn't do. Soviet engineers found part of their solution to this seemingly insurmountable contradiction in a burgeoning technology that the US Navy had already attempted and then abandoned, citing it as too finicky and dangerous. But Soviet engineers, confident in their abilities, forged ahead with the technology. Project 705, instead of using conventional distilled water as a coolant for the nuclear reactor, would use liquid metal. Using liquid metals like lead and bismuth for coolant had some serious benefits. Chief among these was the way neutrons from the reaction interact with the lead. The heavy lead atoms in the coolant reflected the escaping neutrons and returned them to the core, reducing waste, but mainly resulting in high thermal conductivity. Essentially, more of the reactor's heat could be captured and transferred to generate more steam, and then significantly more power with it. This kind of so-called intermediate energy reactor could crucially be made quite small, but still provide the output power levels needed to reach the submarine's incredible top speed using just one shaft and propeller. In fact, the OK-550 reactor was capable of outputting a staggering 155 megawatts, the direct equivalent of about 208,000 mechanical horsepower. But power was far from the only thing the new boat would need to beat her NATO enemies. Radical design innovations were also taking place around the submarine's hull. Normally, the go-to material for building ships and submarines was steel. But steel, as plentiful and versatile as it is, has one drawback, and that is its weight. If Project 705 were to be constructed from steel, like her predecessors and opponents both, she'd be too heavy to outrun them, and too weak to outdive them. No amount of clever engineering on the drawing table was going to solve that problem, so engineers looked at the material itself. Steel was out, but what else does that leave? Well, here the engineers at Malakit turned to one of the Soviet Union's most valuable natural resources. Project 705 would be built almost entirely out of titanium. This might not sound terribly impressive today, because the use of titanium has increased globally, but back in the 60s, even gathering that much of the rare metal in one place would have been an impressive feat in and of itself. Crafting it into a working submarine, on the other hand, would have been nigh on unbelievable, and in fact, when the first reports of a brand new, sleek, modern-looking Soviet submarine made their way to the CIA, many inside the agency remained highly skeptical. Whether or not they believed in the idea that this new submarine used titanium, it was impossible to deny that the new super sub was extremely impressive. The submarine, granted with its now famous NATO codename Alfa, but known to the Soviets as the Lyra, immediately grabbed the attention of intelligence analysts who pored over early grainy images. It was clear from the start that this new boat tied to the fitting out pier at Supremacy shipyard in Leningrad was different from anything they had seen before. Initial estimates by analysts put the Alfa at around 79 metres long, with a displacement of roughly 2,600 tonnes. They also noted that the Alfa's heavily teardrop-shaped hull and short, rounded sail made it clear that this boat was built for high speed and was a true underwater interceptor. These estimates of the new sub's size weren't terribly far off, because the finished submarine would come in at a relatively petite 81.4 metres with a surface displacement of 2,300 tonnes. Now, chief among the analysts poring over the Alfa's design was senior submarine analyst Herb Lloyd, who correctly determined that the new boat was in fact a nuclear submarine, or SSN, and not a diesel-electric boat, as had been initially assumed. This marked the Alfa out as the world's smallest nuclear-powered sub. With the previous trends in Soviet submarine construction laying broken at his feet, Lloyd focused his attention on the Alfa's unique design. The experienced analyst combined piles of reports of unusual-looking hull sections that were highly reflective and bore a different colour to the typical steel plating used in the construction of previous subs, along with reports on increases in production of titanium sponge in the Soviet Union. It led Lloyd to correctly identify the use of an exotic material in the new boat. But despite this, others weren't convinced. See, titanium is a tricky metal to work with because it can't be welded really in the presence of oxygen. And it was thought by many within the US Navy that the Soviets simply didn't have the technology available to build an entire class of submarine with the material. Lloyd would argue his case for 9 years before his eventual retirement, though he never really succeeded in convincing the Navy that the Alfa was indeed a fully titanium sub. Sadly for him, the truth of the matter would only be revealed after his death. But while the CIA argued and debated over the Alfa's exterior, internally, the submarine would boast even more impressive and unprecedented innovations. The small submarine was packed full of automation in her reactor compartments, her engineering spaces, and her torpedo room. It was the first submarine ever to be fitted with an escape pod. With most of her systems run by automated machinery, only a tiny 31-man skeleton crew, made up mostly of officers, was needed to pilot the Alfa on a mission. On December 31st, 1971, the first Alfa-class sub, K-64, was launched at the Supremacy yard in Leningrad. Despite high levels of secrecy surrounding the launch, a crowd of onlookers gathered to watch the Soviet Union's latest creation put to sea for the very first time, under the command of Captain A.S. Pushkin. Initial testing proved that the Alfa could in fact measure up to the gauntlet laid down when the class was first proposed back in 1957. Her speed and her maneuverability was second to none. With an operational top speed of 41 knots underwater, the Alfa remains, to this day, the world's fastest serially produced submarine. Her titanium hull also enabled her to reach depths far in excess of both her NATO counterparts and their weapons. With a test depth of 400 metres, that's over 1,300 feet, and a maximum depth in excess of 600 metres or over 1,900 feet, the Alfa proved to be a magnificently strong boat, with some Soviet sources speculating her true maximum depth to have been in excess of a staggering 1,300 metres or 4,200 feet. That's nearly 5 times the maximum service depth of a World War II U-boat. But these tests also highlighted some critical, unexpected flaws. That engineering marvel of a reactor, the OK-550, proved to be just a bit too far over the cutting edge of what was possible. During K-64's testing, the reactor's primary coolant circuit failed twice. The first failure was able to be repaired quickly, but the second would actually cut the sub's entire career short because the OK-550's unreliability highlighted another critical weakness in its design. When the second failure occurred, the reactor shut down as designed, but as it did so, the temperature dropped below 125 degrees Celsius in the lines, and the liquid metal coolant solidified, bricking the entire reactor for good. When this happened, K-64 had to be towed back into port in an embarrassing spectacle. But as a result of this failure, all subsequent Alphas would be fitted with an improved reactor, the BM-40A. This unit still used the same lead bismuth alloy, but it was far more reliable. As for K-64, well, she'd actually been cut in half as part of the investigation into the reactor failure, with her bow section ultimately being sent off to Leningrad to be used as a simulator to train new crews, and her stern section moored near Yagri Island until 2015, when the reactor was finally removed and placed in long-term storage. In all, 7 Alpha-class subs would be built, with production split between the Sudamek shipyard in Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg, and the Sevmash shipyard in Severodvinsk. As impressive as she was, and for all her cutting-edge and creative innovations, the Alpha proved too costly to build and maintain, with the submarine requiring extensive and costly pierside facilities that kept her on something of a life support system, which cycled hot liquid coolant throughout the reactor when she wasn't in use. The titanium hull, one of the vessel's greatest original strengths, turned out to be one of its bigger weaknesses, because suboptimal welding resulted in cracking and failures as a result of the difficulty faced by Soviet builders who had to work with the tricky new material. Despite those huge technological innovations, the class also found itself quickly outmoded by its NATO rivals. While no Western submarine could ever match her for speed, maneuverability, or depth, advancements in weapons quickly brought the Alpha to heel. The introduction of the American Mk-48 and British Spearfish torpedoes meant that the Soviet super sub could no longer outrun and outdive her enemy's weaponry, and in the event of war, these weapons would be something she'd have to contend with, because the Alpha turned out to be one of the noisiest submarines ever produced. All of that power driving a single shaft coupled with a lack of internal vibration dampening meant that an Alpha at full speed was like a rock concert zipping through the water, advertising its presence to any nearby NATO vessels and basically ringing the dinner bell. But despite these flaws, it's undeniable Soviet engineers had created one of the most beautiful, innovative, and forward-thinking submarines ever built. Though today none remain in service, their hulls cut up and sold for scrap, their radical liquid metal-cooled reactors sitting in storage, their legacy lives on as one of the most revered boats from the Cold War, even in the West, where the Alpha was made famous by an appearance in the Tom Clancy novel and the film The Hunt for Red October. A film which featured not only the Alpha, but one of the Soviet Union's other truly unhinged submarine designs. While the real Project 941 Akula, or Shark, known in the West by its codename Typhoon, doesn't actually boast anything called a caterpillar drive like the fictional Red October, the real thing is, in a way, even more impressive and terrifying than the titular submarine from the Tom Clancy hit novel. A real monster of the deep, the Typhoon remains, to this day, the largest submarine ever constructed, with an astonishing 30,460-ton submerged displacement. That's the equivalent of a World War II aircraft carrier moving at speed underwater. It was built in response to the up-and-coming American Ohio-class SSBN, or ballistic missile nuclear submarine, and would go on to dwarf her American counterpart in both width and displacement. In order to begin development, a specification was issued to the Rubin Design Bureau in 1972, and under the leadership of chief designer S.N. Kovalev, the process of creating the crown jewel of Soviet naval engineering had begun. While the Alpha was something of a fighter plane for the ocean, the Typhoon was the opposite. Like a bomber, a large, lumbering missile truck designed to weather the opening salvos of a nuclear war and rise from under the thick northern ice to deliver a devastating nuclear strike to a recovering enemy. In fact, the Soviets often referred to this submarine as something of an underwater cruiser, even going so far as to add a cruiser's T prefix to the class instead of the usual lone K, which was reserved for submarines. And since her mission was primarily to lurk deep underneath the Arctic ice cap for months on end, the Typhoon was unusually comfortable for a submarine. Normally, subs had been horribly cramped things where you could hardly ever find a place to stand up straight, the Project 941 was downright luxurious, as she came equipped with a swimming pool, a sauna, a gym, and even lounges for off-duty crew and officers to relax in. In fact, due to its comparatively cavernous interior, the Typhoon had a massive reserve buoyancy of over 40%, meaning that when submerged, half of the sub's weight was actually just made up of ballast, leading to them earning the nickname of the water carrier. But make no mistake, this behemoth was no pleasure vessel. The Typhoon's unprecedented accommodations, while they were important for maintaining crew morale on long missions, were actually something of a side effect caused by the immense size required to fit the massive R-39 ballistic missiles. With a range of 8,300 kilometers, or just over 5,100 miles, and equipped with as many as 10 100 to 200 kiloton multiple independent re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs, the R-39 was a terrifying response to the American Trident missile set to be deployed on the upcoming Ohio-class subs. The extreme range meant a Typhoon-class submarine could fire its R-39 missiles clean across the Atlantic, and if one fired its payload off the Portuguese coast, it could hit targets in Colorado. Most terrifyingly of all, though, it could do it submerged and underway at slow speed. The sheer size of this missile dictated that the new submarine had to take a radical departure to those that had come before it. With 20 R-39s fitted, the full fleet of 6 Typhoon submarines alone could rain down the destructive potential of 16,000 of the type of bomb dropped on Hiroshima, except at a range twice the distance from San Francisco to Manhattan. The challenge for designers was to accommodate these huge missiles, which towered to the height of a 4-story building, and fitting 20 of them into the submarine would not be easy. The older Delta class of SSBN subs had carried their missiles in a large compartment behind the sail, which gave them their signature humpback appearance. But for the Typhoon, this arrangement simply wouldn't suffice. The missiles were just far too tall for this solution to be viable. To make it work, engineers had to once again get creative. To solve the problem, designers came up with an ingenious and complex solution that had never before been attempted. The new submarine would essentially be constructed around its missile pack, similar to the way that the American A-10 Warthog was said to be designed around its massive 30mm autocannon. The Typhoon would be kitted out with 20 cavernous launch tubes, tucked neatly between 2 distinct pressure hulls, allowing the huge missiles to sit flush with the deck and eliminate the large hump present on previous Soviet designs. While most submarines are described as being double-hulled, and that they have an outer and an inner pressure hull, the Typhoon is different in that it's essentially 2 totally independent submarines sandwiching a massive missile battery in the middle. Each pressure hull would have its own OK-650 water-cooled reactor, its own engine room and shaft alley, and could function independently of the other in case of an emergency or even battle damage. Each one of those reactors could output an impressive 190 megawatts, enough to run a small city, and deliver enough power to supply each shaft with 50,000 horsepower for a combined total of 100,000 to 2 shrouded, 7-bladed propellers. Situated in between the 2 hulls were, of course, the Missiles Combat Information Center, or CIC, and 2 independent escape pods, along with the fully automated torpedo and rudder control rooms. Like the Alpha, the Typhoon would also incorporate a large amount of titanium in its construction, with the inner pressure hulls being made of the stuff, and the outer hull being made from thick, heavy steel. The steel in this case was an ideal choice because the Typhoon wasn't intended to go into combat against other submarines, but instead to lurk below the thick Arctic ice sheets where that steel armor of the outer hull would be perfect for smashing straight through dense ice. But before construction could even get started, problems had to be sorted out. Due to the immense size laid out in the design, no shipyard in the Soviet Union, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, had the capacity to actually build such a submarine. Before work could even begin, a special assembly building had to be constructed at the Sevmash shipyard, named Workshop 55, rather dull, and this building would house the largest indoor slipway anywhere in the world. It's difficult to understate just how insane and unhinged the scale of the submarine really is. In fact, The rival Malekith Design Bureau, responsible for the already unhinged Alpha class, dubbed the new Typhoon a victory of technology over common sense. Perhaps they had forgotten that they themselves had built a submarine with a reactor that used liquid metal. But regardless, on September 29th, 1980, the first of these victories over common sense, Typhoon TK-208 would enter the water for the very first time at the Sevmash shipyard in Severodvinsk. When early pictures of the Typhoon surfaced in the West, analysts were confused at first as to the reasoning behind the submarine's immense size and its odd shape. Simply put, it was unlike anything they'd seen before. Some theories began to suggest that the behemoth submarine might be equipped with airplanes or helicopters, though the Typhoon's massive missile silo hatches quickly dispelled any questions as to her purpose and gave a hint to the horrifying payload she carried. These leviathans were more than just strategic weapons, though. They were also an important propaganda piece that served as a firm reminder of the Soviet Union's capabilities. And Premier Leonid Brezhnev did not miss an opportunity to remind the world of it. During the 26th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1981, Brezhnev mentioned the country's new superweapon directly when he said, "The Americans have created a new submarine, the Ohio, with Trident 1 missiles. We also have a similar system, the Typhoon." The submarine was built for a terrifying purpose, a last-ditch weapon in the event of the worst-case scenario. Fortunately, it was never needed, and even with all the incredible effort and secrecy needed to build it, history's largest submarine fell prey to a far more ignominious threat than American missiles. All of this incredible engineering and technology came with one major drawback, and that was cost. Simply put, the Typhoons were ruinously expensive. Even in a communist state like the Soviet Union, where prices were controlled, the cost of such a complex and intricate design was enormous, more than twice that of the Delta IV sub. It was just far more than the nation's, by then struggling, stagnant economy could bear. There were plans to build as many as 12 of these things, but soon, budget cuts reduced that number down to 10, and eventually just 6. Only half the planned number would ever be built. Hulls 7, 8, and 9 had actually been laid down and were undergoing construction in 1991, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed and broke apart. During this difficult time, the budget for the Navy of the now new Russian Federation was brutally slashed even further. There was just no money left to complete the submarines. As a result, the unfinished hulls were sold off to be broken up for scrap or used in other projects. In fact, the Typhoons that had actually been constructed still couldn't survive the harsh budget cuts that came with the fall of their parent union. The 90s and 2000s would see all but one of the mighty vessels decommissioned, with just the TK-208, the first of the class, continuing to serve as a test platform for the Beluga missile, set to be used in the new Borai class of submarine. That vessel, renamed to the Dmitry Donskoy in the year 2000, was finally decommissioned on the 6th of February 2023 after 43 years of service. The engineering prowess put on display in the design and construction of both of these incredible machines is truly remarkable. Both the Alfa and Typhoon are prime examples of what can be achieved by engineers when convention is hurled out the window. Even to this day, these bold, radical, downright unhinged submarine designs still captivate and impress. And although they were flawed, ambitious probably to a fault, overly complex, impractical, and brutally expensive, you just can't help but admire the skill and the tenacity of the men and women who designed and built them. It's said that necessity is the mother of invention, and in a nation that often struggled to provide adequate food or electricity to its people, those working at the bleeding edge of technology were forced to throw out the notion that better is the enemy of good enough, and think outside the box to deliver what must have seemed like impossible goals. They did just that, giving us history's fastest and biggest submarines. They were terrifying vessels, but you also have to admit, they were pretty damn cool.